Picture a beach in northern France, late May 1940, stretching for miles under a gray sky. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers stand in long, exposed lines across open sand, waiting their turn to reach the water, while enemy aircraft circle somewhere beyond the clouds. Behind them, a German army that had just shattered the fastest, most complete military collapse Western Europe had ever seen was closing in. In front of them, nothing but open water and a fleet of small civilian boats that had never been designed for anything like this. Nobody standing on that beach knew yet whether they were about to be rescued or captured. Some of those men had been marching and fighting in retreat for over a week straight, sleeping in short stretches whenever the column paused, uncertain from 1 hour to the next whether the road ahead led toward the coast or straight into an enemy position. Officers moved along the beach organizing makeshift queues, trying to maintain some kind of order among exhausted troops who had watched their own vehicles destroyed or abandoned days earlier. Above them, the distant drone of aircraft engines was a constant, nerve-fraying presence, impossible to fully tell apart from friendly patrols until it was too late to matter. That single week decided far more than most people realize. If it goes differently, there's a very real chance World War II ends with a negotiated peace favoring Germany, no D-Day, and an entirely different map of Europe than the one that actually followed. Here's what actually happened. In May 1940, German forces launched an invasion of France and the Low Countries that moved faster than anyone on the Allied side had prepared for, pushing armored divisions through the Ardennes forest in a route French planners had largely dismissed as impassable for tanks. Within roughly 2 weeks, German forces had split the Allied armies in two and pushed the British Expeditionary Force, along with large portions of the French and Belgian armies, into a shrinking pocket around the port town of Dunkirk, backs against the sea, with no clear route out. Then something happened that historians still argue about to this day. On May 24th, with German panzer divisions within striking distance of finishing the encirclement, Hitler approved an order halting the tank advance for roughly 2 to 3 days. The exact reasoning remains debated. Some point to caution from commanders worried about overextended supply lines and exhausted tank crews. Others to Hermann Göring, lobbying for the Luftwaffe to finish the job from the air and claim the glory. Others to simple uncertainty about marshy terrain ahead. Whatever the reason, that pause gave the trapped Allied forces just enough time to organize a defensive perimeter and begin an evacuation nobody expected to succeed at any meaningful scale. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding the forces closest to the pocket, had genuine concerns about pushing his armored divisions too far, without adequate infantry and artillery support behind them. Worried a counterattack could catch overextended tanks in a vulnerable position. Hitler, reviewing the situation from his own headquarters, ultimately backed that caution, while Göring separately argued the Luftwaffe alone could finish encircling and destroying the trapped armies from the air, sparing the army the risk and letting his own branch claim a decisive victory. Both arguments turned out to be badly mistaken. The bombing campaign never came close to preventing the evacuation, and the pause meant to protect exhausted panzer crews instead handed the trapped Allied forces the exact window they needed to survive. British planners initially hoped to rescue perhaps 45,000 men. What actually happened over the following days, an operation called Dynamo, pulled out roughly 338,000 British and French soldiers, using naval destroyers alongside an improvised fleet of fishing boats, pleasure yachts, and other small civilian vessels that crossed the channel again and again under near constant air attack. Most of the Army's heavy equipment, tanks, trucks, and artillery, was abandoned on the beaches and left behind. But the men themselves, the trained core of Britain's professional army, made it home. The improvised nature of that rescue fleet is easy to romanticize in hindsight, but it really was built almost entirely from whatever could float and cross open water. Weekend sailing boats, harbor ferries, and small fishing vessels, many crewed by civilian volunteers who had no military training at all, made repeated trips back and forth across a stretch of sea actively targeted by enemy aircraft and artillery. Some boats made the crossing only once, before being sunk or damaged beyond repair. Others made the trip several times in a single day, packed well beyond any reasonable capacity, simply because every additional soldier pulled off that beach mattered enough to justify the risk. What followed reshaped the rest of the war. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister only 2 weeks earlier, used the evacuation to steady a nation that could easily have concluded the war was already lost. His speech to Parliament days later, promising Britain would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and the streets and the hills, and would never surrender, drew directly on the emotional momentum of soldiers who had just been pulled off those exact beaches. The rescued army became the backbone of Britain's home defense during the Battle of Britain that summer, and years later, the trained manpower and continued national will to keep fighting is part of what allowed Britain to serve as the staging ground for the eventual Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944, an invasion that becomes almost unimaginable without a Britain still in the war, still allied, and still holding the western edge of the continent. So that's what happened. Now, otherwise. Picture that same beach, that same week, except this time, the halt order never comes. Maybe Hitler ignores Rundstedt's caution and Göring's lobbying alike. Maybe the marshy terrain concerns turn out to be overstated, and the panzer commanders push forward the moment they see the opportunity in front of them. The tanks that paused for 2 to 3 days in our actual history simply keep moving, and the pocket around Dunkirk closes before large-scale evacuation can begin. Without those 2 or 3 days, Operation Dynamo either never launches at scale or gets cut off before completing more than a fraction of its actual rescue. Instead of 338,000 soldiers reaching Britain, the majority of the British Expeditionary Force, along with huge numbers of French and Belgian troops, ends up captured. Britain doesn't just lose its equipment on those beaches in this version of the story. It loses the trained, professional core of the army it would need to defend itself, to eventually retake the continent, and to convince anyone, including its own citizens, that continuing the war is a fight it can actually win. The political fallout hits almost immediately. Churchill had been Prime Minister for barely 2 weeks when the historical evacuation happened, and his position was nowhere near as secure as it looks in hindsight. Several senior figures in his own government, including Lord Halifax, had seriously argued for exploring a negotiated settlement with Germany just days before Dunkirk actually unfolded. Historians who've studied this exact turning point argue that without the emotional and military lifeline the real evacuation provided, the argument for negotiating with Hitler rather than continuing an apparently hopeless war becomes significantly harder for Churchill to resist. Losing the bulk of the trained army on the beaches rather than bringing it home may have been exactly the kind of catastrophic blow that tips the internal political argument toward the negotiators instead of toward Churchill's defiance. France offers an uncomfortable preview of exactly what that outcome could have looked like. Weeks after the actual Dunkirk evacuation, with its own army defeated and Paris under German occupation, France did negotiate a settlement, splitting into a German-occupied zone and a nominally independent but heavily compromised southern government based in the town of Vichy that largely cooperated with German demands. There's no guarantee Britain's fate would have mirrored France's exactly, given its status as an island with its own navy still intact. But the basic political pressure toward some kind of accommodation, once the will and the manpower to keep fighting are removed, follows a very similar logic on both sides of the channel. Follow that shift forward, and the map of the war changes dramatically. A Britain that negotiates some kind of settlement whether a full armistice or a more limited agreement securing its own safety while abandoning the continent, removes the one obstacle standing between Germany and complete, uncontested control of Western Europe. There's no British base left across the Channel to build toward an eventual invasion. There's no continued Western Front to worry about at all. Germany's military planners, freed entirely from having to garrison against a British threat that no longer meaningfully exists, gain the ability to shift overwhelming additional resources toward the Eastern Front. That matters enormously for exactly what comes next historically. Roughly a year after the actual Dunkirk evacuation, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, already one of the largest military operations in history, even while still maintaining forces to guard against a British-held Western Europe. Remove that Western concern entirely, and Germany enters its invasion of the Soviet Union with more troops, more resources, and none of the strategic distraction that historically forced difficult choices about where to commit limited supplies and manpower. Whether that extra margin would have been enough to change the eventual outcome on the Eastern Front is impossible to know for certain, but it's exactly the kind of resource advantage that historians studying this scenario point to as a meaningful and deeply unsettling variable. Consider what specifically shifts. Divisions historically tied down occupying and garrisoning coastal France, watching for a British-backed uprising or invasion that never has to happen in this scenario, become available for the Eastern Front instead. Fuel, aircraft, and manufacturing capacity that historically had to be split between defending against Britain and supplying the Eastern campaign could concentrate entirely on one front. Even a modest percentage increase in available combat power, sustained over the brutal, grinding months of fighting across the Soviet Union, could plausibly move key battles that in our actual history came down to remarkably thin margins. The defense of Moscow in the winter of 1941, among the most famous examples of a campaign that nearly succeeded and then didn't. And there's the harder question sitting underneath all of it. Without a still-fighting Britain to serve as a staging ground, a base for organizing resistance movements, and eventually a launch point for retaking the continent, the entire shape of how World War II ends in Europe becomes almost unrecognizable. No Battle of Britain to inspire continued resistance. No later buildup of American troops and equipment across the English countryside. No realistic path to a Normandy landing in 1944, because there's no secure territory close enough to the continent left in Allied hands to launch it from. The war in the Pacific, driven by an entirely separate set of tensions with Japan, may still happen roughly on its historical schedule. But the war in Europe, without Britain still standing and still fighting, risks ending with Nazi Germany holding uncontested control over the entire continent for years, possibly decades, longer than it actually managed. America's entry into the war changes shape, too. The United States historically joined the European war partly because it already had a functioning Allied government across the Atlantic to coordinate with, supply, and eventually stage troops through on the way to liberating the continent. Remove that partner, and even after Pearl Harbor forces American involvement in the Pacific, there's no obvious equivalent foothold left in Europe to build toward an invasion from. American strategy might shift entirely toward the Pacific theater, treating the European war as someone else's already settled outcome, rather than a front still worth fighting for, at least until circumstances on the continent changed enough to make renewed intervention look possible again. The resistance movements that historically kept organized opposition alive across occupied Europe, coordinating with British intelligence, receiving supplies dropped from British aircraft, and drawing hope from the knowledge that an ally was still fighting just across the Channel, would be operating in a far bleaker landscape as well. Underground networks in France, Norway, and elsewhere, leaned heavily on the assurance that liberation was a matter of when, not if. Remove that assurance, and resistance work becomes a far more isolated, far more hopeless undertaking, with far less external support and far less reason to believe the occupation would ever actually end. So maybe the real lesson of Dunkirk isn't really about the boats, or the soldiers, or even the beach itself. It's about how much weight a single, still debated tactical pause carried, not just for how many men came home, but for whether an entire government kept fighting a war that, at that exact moment, looked very close to already lost. Remove those 2 or 3 days, and the argument that ultimately convinced an anxious, freshly appointed prime minister and a divided cabinet to keep fighting may never have had anything solid enough to stand on. If a decision this small, made for reasons historians still can't fully agree on, ended up determining whether an entire continent spent the next several years under occupation or under liberation, it raises an uneven, uncomfortable question worth sitting with. How many other wars we consider historically inevitable in their outcome actually hinged on a pause, a hesitation, or a single unclear order that could just as easily have gone the other way? It's worth remembering, too, that none of the men making those decisions in real time had any idea how much weight they carried. Rundstedt was managing a logistics concern. Göring was chasing credit for his own branch of the military. Neither one was thinking in terms of world maps or decades-long consequences. They were making ordinary, in-the-moment judgment calls under pressure, the same way military commanders always have. And one of those ordinary calls happened to sit at the exact hinge point an entire war's outcome would eventually swing on. That's exactly where we're headed next time on Otherwise, into the battles that were won by an order that almost wasn't given. Subscribe and find out how close the map really came to looking permanent.